Greetings, AP World History nerds, and welcome to another day of AP World History Modern live stream lessons. My name is Chad Smith. Again, I've been with you every other day since the beginning of this and toward the end of March. And I am proud to be a teacher at MacArthur High School in Irving, Texas, which is in the middle of DFW. Before we get into our lesson today, let's take a minute and go over the lesson, the AP World History exam practice that came from Mr. Logereau at the end of the day yesterday. At the end of the day yesterday, Mr. Logereau gave us a secondary source and asked us to respond to 3 unique short answer prompts that use that secondary source. So in the first prompt, it said, identify one major claim that John McNeill advances in the passage regarding the historical significance of pollution in the late 20th century. See, we can't just say here that pollution killed a lot of people or pollution killed thousands of people, because all we're doing if we do that is we're understanding a claim. But we're not just understanding a claim in this prompt. We have to situate that claim, and we have to understand how McNeill situates his claim in historical significance. So here are 3 possible responses. One possible response is that McNeill claims increasing air pollution in China, the Third World, and the Soviet bloc offset air quality improvements in Japan, Western Europe, and the United States. We're going to learn more today about how, as the 20th century moved on, industrialization decreased in places like the United States, Japan, and Western Europe, and increased in places like Latin America and Asia. And that situates his claims about air pollution in historical significance. He also situates his claim in historical significance by looking at the number of deaths in both World War I and World War II, or the number of deaths in the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919. In both of these cases, he's comparing the number of air pollution deaths to the number of deaths in an important historical event that readers might be more familiar with. The third potential answer, is around the same concept, but this is when in this answer, you might have taken the opportunity to show that it was a more global issue and not such a local or regional issue. Let's look at question B. Question B asks you, the student, to explain one way in which the economic developments in the late 20th century led to the environmental effects outlined in the passage. So in this case, you have to have a clear understanding of the developments of the 20th century. What kind of technological developments and economic developments, what kind of changes took place that led to increased deaths as a result of air pollution? Well, there are several potential answers here. Increased industrial production led to greater urbanization and air pollution. The increased production of petroleum and the corresponding rise in the number of automobiles led to greater air pollution. The growth of commercial agriculture led to greater air pollution. And finally, as many states in Asia and Latin America began industrializing their economies, air pollution increased because of concerns that imposing air qualities on these newly industrial societies might make them uncompetitive with Western states that already had thoroughly industrial urban centers. Let's look at question C. Question C asks you to understand the limitations of Mr. McNeill's research, to understand how Mr. McNeill's research might be incomplete or not thorough enough to be certain. One clear limitation is that his estimates are very broad, and those broad estimates are hard to prove because there's such a big gap between the starting end of his estimate and the ending end of his estimate. Another potential response here is that the estimates from which McNeill claims are based on likely inaccurate, because it's very difficult to determine whether or not someone has died explicitly from air pollution, or if air pollution is the underlying cause or prominent cause of their death. That's a very challenging metric to measure, which is another limitation of Mr. McNeill's research. Remember, there are more answers than the ones I've offered you here today. So if you have another response to the prompt, and you think it's right, but I didn't give it as a possible correct response, talk to your own AP history teacher, because there's a good chance that you also are on the right track. Okay, so normally we spend time at the beginning of every lesson doing a warm-up that is designed to get our mind ready to learn about a new topic and understand some new content. Today, I'm going to take a different approach to our warm-up altogether. And this afternoon, the College Board released a ton of information about how exactly you as a student will be assessed for the 2020 AP World History test. So instead of doing an activity, I'm going to go over that information with you. So let's start at the beginning. The AP World History test is going to take place on May 21st, 2020. And you might be confused looking at why there's a whole bunch of different times, but the reality is the College Board needs to make sure that everyone is taking the test at the exact same moment. And in order to do that, they need to take the test in different times according to their time zone. If you're like me and you live in Dallas or you live in the central time zone, then your students will test at 1 p.m. If you live on the East Coast in Florida or New York or one of the Carolinas, then you and your students will test at 2 p.m. If you live in Seattle or the western coast of California, you'll be testing at 11 a.m. If you're not exactly sure what time zone you live in, please do the research, because I would hate for you to miss the AP World History test because you weren't aware of the proper time to take the test. So ask your AP teacher, talk to your parents, find out from someone at your school what time zone you live in so you know when to take the AP World History test. Okay, let's get into some more detailed information that I know you're excited to hear. What type of test will you be taking? Well, you already know that you're going to be taking a 45-minute test that'll be only free response questions. We can now tell you that it will actually be one free response question. You will get one document-based question. That's right. Your AP test this year is going to be based on one DBQ. But since you only have 45 minutes, the College Board is limiting this DBQ to 5 documents instead of the usual 7. Now, let's talk about the time. Oh, and before I do that, let me remind you, just like the original DBQ, one of the 5 documents will not be text-based. Instead, it'll be some sort of visual document, a map, chart, graph, or picture that will help you answer the prompt. So, something that you're not used to when it comes for testing is being responsible for your own time. Oftentimes, proctors provide announcements and clocks all around the room to make sure students have ample idea about the time that's left on their test. But because you'll be testing at home this year, you will not have a proctor to help you with your test. Therefore, it's extraordinarily important that you practice over the next month being aware of your own timing while taking and practicing the AP World History test. You will have 45 minutes to read the documents, understand the prompt, and develop a cohesive response. And you will have 5 minutes to take that response and submit it in the appropriate manner according to the device you've chosen to test on. If you fail to submit your test in the 5 minutes, it will not be accepted and will not be scored. Let's talk about devices. The test can be taken on any type of a device. You can take your test on a desktop or a laptop, a tablet or a phone, or even on a phone. However, you can only log into the test on one device. So do not plan to log into the test on multiple devices in order to try to find a way to take advantage of the system. How will you submit your AP World History test? Well, you'll have a couple of options, and it's important that you practice and think about these things over the next few months as you decide. You'll be able, if you take your test on a phone, you'll be able to do a handwritten version of your essay and take pictures of it and submit those pictures. If you do your AP test on a desktop or a laptop, you'll probably type your AP test in a document word processor and submit that as a PDF. Here's the thing. There can be pluses and minuses to both types of device. When I look at my cell phone, I have a hard time imagining how exactly am I going to read a prompt and 5 entire documents and scroll back and forth between those documents as I begin to develop a comprehensive response to the question. However, I'm far more accustomed to handwriting my DBQ responses. And it's much more difficult, it may be much more difficult for you as a student to type, especially if you're what we call a chicken pecker. A chicken pecker is one of those students who goes about typing one letter at a time. If you're a chicken pecker, using a desktop or a laptop might not be the best method for you unless you spend some time over the next month practicing. Let's talk for a moment about test security. The College Board is working really hard to make sure that the integrity of the AP World History test is maintained through this extraordinarily difficult time of at-home testing. So, let me implore you not to make any efforts, even jokes on social media platforms about any kind of collaborative or collective work. Don't even do a meme about communism. Don't put anything on any of your social media sites that can create the impression to the College Board that you have done some sort of giving or accepting help to any of your AP World History peers. The College Board is going to take measures to make sure that you identify identify who you are and that the correct person is testing several times before the AP test begins. And the College Board has said that they're initiating a number of protocols that they refuse to announce in order to make them more effective, in order to prevent students from cheating on the AP World History test. The consequences that the College Board has outlined for cheating are rather severe, so please take them seriously. If the College Board suspects that you as a student have done anything to sacrifice the integrity of your AP World History response, they will send that information to every single school that you have previously or in the future have asked for your AP scores or SAT scores to go to. So being caught in such a circumstance would create very long-term dire circumstances for you as a student. Please maintain the integrity of the AP World History test and make sure that your DBQ response is a demonstration of your personal excellence. One more important piece of information before I move on. I know that there are a lot of students around the country who have a difficult time accessing the necessary equipment or internet to be able to properly take the AP World History test. If you're currently watching this on a cell phone that doesn't have the ability to take pictures at the quality necessary for submitting a PDF, or you've been watching with a friend of some shared devices with multiple high school students, other kinds of situations that may create all kinds of problems for taking the AP World History test, please go to www.cb.org/tech. And the College Board will find a way to help you get the devices you need to make sure that you're prepared to be successful on the AP World History test. Now, let's get to the part that you really want to know, which is how exactly will you be assessed when you take the AP World History test? Now, I'll go ahead and let you know at the beginning of this discussion that you can go into the description of this YouTube video, and you can see in that description the actual College Board rubric that has been designed in order to let you know what the 2020 rubric is going to be. And it highlights the specific differences between the normal rubric and the special coronavirus rubric. So the normal rubric is divided up into 4 categories. And so I'm going to go through the categories of the normal rubric. But before I do that, I want you to know that the DBQ is measured on a scale of 10 points. That's right. Instead of earning up to 7 points for the DBQ, this year and this year only, you'll be able to earn up to 10 points for your DBQ. However, your grade that will be submitted to you and to colleges after the AP test will still come on a scale of 1 to 5, where 3 represents a mastery of the AP World History course, and for most colleges around the country offers you some form of college credit. And we don't know now, and probably won't ever know, how many of the 1 through 10 will translate into what of the 1 through 5. So the number one rule I always give my own students is just do everything you can. When you start an AP test, whether it's the world history test or the calculus test or any of the tests that are given, it's important to understand that you start with a 0. And all you get to do throughout the entire test is demonstrate your own mastery of the content and the skills that that test is assessing. And when you do something well, you earn a point. And when you make a mistake, the College Board ignores that mistake because they know that they didn't give you a chance to go back and edit or proofread your work. So you can't lose points. So as you go into the AP World History test, repeat to yourself the mantra, do everything I can. Do everything I can. And focus on that mantra to help you be successful. Let's look at the rubric. The first 2 parts of the rubric are the same as the traditional AP World History rubric. Part 1 is thesis. Thesis means that you as a student can make a comprehensive, cohesive, historically accurate claim in response to the prompt. You must make that claim in response to the prompt in the beginning or in the end of your essay. I highly encourage all students to make sure they put that essay in their first and last paragraph in order to create a safety net. Like I said, if you make a mistake, the College Board will ignore the mistake. So if you do it twice, then you have a safety net. If you do it twice and you make a mistake once, you can still get the point. Remember, a thesis can be 1 sentence or it can be multiple sentences. However, a multiple sentence thesis must be consecutive, meaning the sentences must come one right after the next. The second point that stays exactly the same on the AP World History rubric is the context point. Providing context means, can you take the ideas or the concepts of the prompt and can you place them in broader historical situations? Many teachers use the scrolling stories and yellow letters before the Star Wars movies in order to help students understand the idea of context. Other teachers look at plays and how before a play starts, a written play takes the time to establish a setting for the play. The idea of context is to say, what broader historical principle, what big deal in history makes this prompt make more sense? That's context. The next category is evidence and how you provide evidence. Normally, this category has 3 opportunities to earn points, but in the year 2020, you'll have 5 opportunities to earn points in this category. The first way that you can earn points in the evidence category is the easiest thing to do on the whole AP World History test. As a matter of fact, I'm telling you right now that everybody watching this live stream automatically should get at least 1 point on the AP World History test. Because in order to get the first point, all you have to do is describe the content of at least 2 of the documents. You can't quote the content, but you just have to describe the content of at least 2 of the documents and do so generally on topic. This is the easiest point to earn, and there are more points that you can earn when it comes to using the documents. The next 2 points involve using the document to support a claim. The best way to do this is to put your claim in the topic sentence of a paragraph, as we discussed a couple days ago with some of our practice. If your claim is in the topic sentence of your paragraph, then you use the rest of the paragraph to prove your point. You prove your point, your claim in the topic sentence using the documents. If you can use 2 documents to support a claim, you'll earn a second point. And if you can use 4 documents to support a claim, then you'll earn a third point. Notice that these 3 points build on one another. If you've used 4 documents, you've also therefore mentioned 2 documents and used 2 documents. So these points come along with the next. The next point is about providing your own outside evidence and using that information to support a claim. Normally, if you do this one time on an AP World History test, you get 1 point for it. But this year, the College Board is offering you additional opportunities. So you can do it twice and you can earn 2 points. By doing this task 2 times, you can earn 2 points. The last category also has expanded opportunities to achieve points on the AP World History test. This category is about analysis and reason. Typically, on the AP World History test, if a student can successfully analyze the source of one of 3 documents by using the historical situation, the intended audience, the purpose or point of view, then that student will earn 1 point. But this year, the College Board is actually making it so that doing that 1 time will equal 1 point, and doing it a second time will equal 2 points. So this year, you can do the source analysis less than you normally would on a regular DBQ and earn more points than you would on a regular DBQ. The very last point is often nicknamed the complexity point, and nothing about this point has changed from your normal rubric. It requires students to develop a complicated or nuanced claim and to develop that claim through multiple pieces of evidence throughout their essay. This is one of the most challenging tasks on the DBQ, and it sets apart the very, very best argumentative writers in the AP World History amongst AP World History colleagues. I recommend to my own students that if they're not comfortable understanding what it means to develop a complicated or nuanced claim, and they're still working to produce some of the other points on this list, that they focus on what they know they can achieve. That's why we have the mantra, do everything I can. Okay. Again, if you have questions about what the 2020 rubric or the 2020 AP test will look like, you can get additional information and more specific and detailed information at the link in the description below. Or, as always, you should talk to your AP teachers and ask them for help in understanding the new AP rubric. It's not a new rubric, it's a temporary, one-time only rubric. Let's look at what we're going to learn today in our lesson. Today, we're going to look at the modern global economy by understanding continuities and changes from before 1900 and throughout the 1900s. And then we're going to understand how in the world, after World War II, social categories and social structures have changed or maintained over time. Excuse me. So let's take a look. Here are some important characteristics of the post-Cold War economy. One of the most significant characteristics of the post-Cold War economy is what seems to be the completion of the process of globalization. We'll talk more about what globalization means in a moment. Another important characteristic is economic liberalization, or decreasing government regulations over businesses and the economy and increasing the ideas of free market economies. In the second half of the 20th century, we see the massive growth of knowledge-based economies, and we see a transition of much of the industrial production leaving countries like the United States and Western Europe and moving to places like Asia and Latin America. We also see the creation of transnational economic institutions, or organizations created by members of multiple countries in order to promote trade. And we see a major continuation, but at the same time, a change because of the increase in the role of multinational corporations in the global economy. Okay, let's take a moment and look at each of those characteristics on the list in a little bit more detail. Globalization is the interconnectivity of people around the world. And it's not new if you've been studying world history since the beginning of the year 1200. As a matter of fact, in Unit 2, you learned a lot about long-distance trade networks, such as the Indian Ocean Trade Network. And long-distance trade networks were an example of globalization. As religion spread from place to place and syncretism, like the Swahili city-states, developed, there was an interconnection of people from around different parts of the world. However, that example of globalization was minimal and isolated to a certain area of the world. The same thing happened with the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange further increased the degrees of globalization, but nothing has increased globalization more than the information, transportation, and communication technologies that have developed in the last 50 years. From radios to televisions to cell phones and the internet, the globe has become massively interconnected. A perfect example of that is the very fact that I'm sitting in my dining room in Lewisville, Texas, just a little bit south of Dallas, Texas, and you might be sitting in your own dining room, living room, or bedroom in any part of the world. Another characteristic of modern economies in the 20th century is economic liberalization, or decreasing the amount of government regulations placed over economic institutions. Economic liberalization happened across the country in multiple states, but we're going to specifically look at its effects in China. The other day, we learned about the end of the Cold War and how we saw economic liberalization, or perestroika, in the Soviet Union. The same thing happened in in China, and the end of communism and the introduction of new free market and economic liberalization. However, it's important to understand that in the Soviet Union, perestroika came along with the idea of glasnost, or openness, major political reforms that offered people new freedoms and opportunity to participate in their economic systems and political systems, China sought to relax the restrictions on the economy without relaxing their own version of political totalitarianism. For example, instead of having collective land, they allowed peasants to lease land from the government and grow their own crops. This was a massive improvement in the agricultural yield. And for the first time, as a result of Deng Xiaoping's reforms, China was able to supply an agricultural surplus rather than a diminishing return, which led to massive droughts and famine during the Chinese Communist era. Other reforms included allowing factories to build manufactured goods designed for consumer purchasing, and even the encouragement of foreign investors to come in and build factories of their own in order to use the Chinese population as labor and provide jobs for Chinese people, but oftentimes the markets for those goods were not in China. As a result of the economic changes taking place without any kind of political freedom, there were massive protests for years against the lack of democracy and democratic reforms in China. The most famous example of these protests took place in what's known as Tiananmen Square. For more than 7 weeks, students, professors, and other people who cared greatly about increasing their own political voice protested publicly, putting their lives, and the lives of those they loved at risk. This lasted for 7 weeks until finally the Chinese government imposed martial law and rolled tanks and armed soldiers into Tiananmen Square. Protesters set up blockades trying to stop the tanks and the Chinese army from getting into Tiananmen Square, and the Chinese army opened fire on the protesters. It's impossible to know for sure, but it's possible that thousands of Chinese protesters died that day. But the government of China to this day denies the existence of this event ever happening. And even to this day, people who have public memorials to the deaths of individuals who died at Tiananmen Square can be imprisoned. There were other countries that pursued economic liberalization, but we're not going to have an opportunity to go through every single example today. So I encourage you to pick one or two and do a little bit of research on your own, or ask your teacher for some more information. Examples include Margaret Thatcher, the United Kingdom Prime Minister, Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States, and Augusto Pinochet, the President of Chile. You may remember that Pinochet was a dictator who was propped up by the United States of America and its allies in order to stop the spread of communism in Latin America. In many cases, there are critics of this idea of economic liberalization. And the critics of economic liberalization have the same criticism of capitalism that's existed from its very origins. See, oftentimes free enterprise meant less regulations on businesses, and those lack of regulations led businesses to take their manufacturing out of the United States of America or the United Kingdom and into places like Latin America and Asia, where they didn't have to pay the same wages or have the same regulations enforcing certain conditions to protect the workers. These are the same problems that led to the development of systems like communism and socialism in the first place. And so the problems continued even as economic liberalization took a prominent stand in the late 20th century. Another major change in the economies of the end of the 20th century is the existence of knowledge economies. Knowledge economies are based on information and community technology. And in order to develop knowledge economies, governments and private investors support things like research, education, innovation, and technological infrastructure, instead of things like labor and in factories and construction and things like that. You can see two examples of companies that play a significant role in the United States knowledge economy. In the top picture, you see the headquarters of Apple. Apple, the one that produces your iPhone or your iPad or your watch or the system you're watching television on right now. This is in California, in the Silicon Valley. And Apple, like almost every other knowledge economy, is headquartered in a country where knowledge economies are prominent, but uses manufacturing in countries in Asia and Latin America. On the bottom, you see the headquarters of another Silicon Valley, California knowledge economy, one that you're actually extraordinarily familiar with, and I'm certain you've spent a lot of time utilizing over the last several weeks. You might be able to tell from the picture, that's the headquarters of Netflix. The United States isn't the only knowledge economy. Much of Western Europe was knowledge economies, including the country of Finland. And Japan also progressed into a knowledge economy in the latter half of the 20th century. Because these countries were knowledge economies, were formerly great industrial powers, it's important to understand that in much of these cases, the industrial production left these states, leaving thousands and thousands of workers unemployed. And the manufacturing systems moved to new states in places in Latin America and Asia. For example, Bangladesh. You can see at the top a picture of a Bangladesh textile factory. Textiles make up for 80% of the exports of Bangladesh manufacturing. Vietnam also has a significant textile industry, but they also make electronics and phones. It's important to understand that the reason that companies want to place their manufacturing sectors in these countries is because of the very little regulation that these governments have over the working conditions and the wages of these factories. Mexico and Honduras are two commonly recognized Latin American states where manufacturing takes place. Manufacturing grew in Mexico after the North American Free Trade Agreement, also called NAFTA, which many supporters liked because it opened up free trade and closed tariffs between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. But many critics did not like because it opened up many American companies to moving their manufacturing sectors to Mexico and sacrificing thousands of American jobs. Another characteristic of the modern global economy is the transnational economic institutions promoting trade. That's a whopper of a phrase. So let's break it down. What this means is that many different countries would work together, transnational, and they would work together to create organizations or institutions. And those institutions existed simply to promote trade. For example, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was known as GATT and later became known as the World Trade Organization. When GATT was created, the international average for tariffs was at 40%. That means purchasers had to spend 40% more money on taxes if they were buying a foreign good. It was a prominent barrier on international trade. But by the end of the 20th century, because of the work of the organization GATT and later WTO, tariffs had been reduced to an international average of only 5%. greatly increasing the amount of trade, the amount of international trade that could take place. There are other examples of transnational economic institutions. The North American Free Trade Organization is, North American Free Trade Association is one we just talked about, or NAFTA. Another is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, known as ASEAN. Okay. Our last significant example of the modern economy is multinational corporations. Now listen, a multinational corporation is nothing new. And we've been talking about them throughout this entire discussion. As we've mentioned, companies like Apple, who have their knowledge-based economy centered in one country and their manufacturing sectors centered in other countries. But we've learned about multinational corporations as late as the 15 and 1600s with the creation of joint stock companies in Britain and the Netherlands. Joint stock companies were companies centered in European states that were designed to colonize and economically exploit other countries around the world. That's multinational. However, multinational corporations today are not the exception. Instead, they're the driving force of the global economy. Such major multinational corporations include Google, which of course you're using at this very moment because Google owns YouTube. And Nestle, which is not just responsible for chocolate, but is a massive producer of various kinds of food and agricultural goods around the country. And a country headquartered in India called Mahindra and Mahindra. Let's take a break from understanding multinational corporations and let's try to understand some of the ways social structures changed in the second part of the 20th century. In the second part of the 20th century, there's a sharp turn in an understanding of people's rights around the world. You might remember that prior to World War II, and dating back all the way into the 19th century, the primary concept of white people in Western Europe and in the United States of America was ideas about social Darwinism, the white man's burden, or the idea of civilizing imperialism as a civilizing mission. However, after World War II, there developed a rights-based global discourse that turned these ideas on its head. And instead, it became the norm to seek out rights for all people, regardless of race, gender, or religion, instead of excluding people based on those very factors. As a result of this global discourse, we see practical changes take place as access to education, political participation, and professional roles become more inclusive in regards to those same categories we just mentioned. Finally, we see movements of people around the world actually seeking to disrupt what they saw as the environmental and economic inequality that took place as a result of this global integration. Just like before, let's take a couple minutes to go over some specific examples of these concepts and better understand them. One of the driving forces behind the new rights-based discourse was the 1948 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, seen here being displayed by American former First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was actually a chairwoman for the United Nations in the development of this document. This document set up a list of rights guaranteed to all people, regardless of their state, their race, their religious background, their gender, or various segments of society that tend to divide people. It also sought out to protect some of the most vulnerable and oppressed members of our society, like children and refugees. Alongside the rights-based discourse came a global notion of feminism. As not just in the United States, but around the world, women demanded greater rights and opportunities, greater access to education. And they not only demanded these things, but they also earned them. Another example of a specific rights-based movement was the Negritude movement, which originated in West Africa. This was a movement that encouraged people to celebrate their Blackness and understand their Blackness as a virtue rather than something to create shame, which is how Black people have been taught to understand race for most of their lives. A third and final example of rights-based discourse took place in Latin American religion, as Catholicism and socialism blended together to interpret Jesus' teachings as demanding freedom from political, economic, and social oppression. Oftentimes, liberation theologians were killed for their movements by military dictators who ruled Latin American countries. But in some places like Venezuela, liberation theology caught on. Although not imperfectly, as dictator there, Hugo Chavez certainly had a number of human rights abuses. In 2013, the Catholic Church elected its new pope and the first pope to ever be from Latin America. And this pope actually ended the Catholic Church's opposition towards liberation theology. Just like when we discussed the ideas of decolonization in the period after World War II, it's really important to me that you as a student understand that the new roles in societies that developed for women and people of color and other marginalized members of society around the world were opportunities that those people demanded and earned, and not opportunities that were given to them. It's not like the oppressive classes of the world decided that it was time to restructure society in order to create more equal systems. Instead, people demanded access to new roles in society. I'm going to move really quickly because we're about to run over our 45-minute goal for time here. But I want to point out a couple of things. Around the world throughout the 1920s, women gained the access to vote and therefore participate and even have roles in the political structures of their countries. The United States civil rights movement demanded change and received change as it went through the 1960s. One important change was the introduction of the United States Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's important to note that these ideas, while ending the Jim Crow era and allowing for massive amounts of Black people to vote and participate in the American political system, did not end racial oppression in America, as Black people across the state have continued for decades to demand more equal rights. Mr. Logereau told us a lot about apartheid the other day, and so if you missed that, I encourage you to go back and look at his lesson where he discussed things like Nelson Mandela and Trevor Noah. But the end of apartheid in the 1990s is another example of this new role in society. And in India, in the new Indian constitution in 1948, caste was designed, or the idea of Dalits and discriminating against Dalits or the untouchables was officially banned in the new constitution. However, that discrimination continued throughout the 20th century, and toward the end of the 20th century, India introduced a new policy of caste reservation, which sought to end systematic oppression against Dalits by reserving specific jobs in government and specific jobs in the public sector that were normally denied to people because of their caste status. Finally, one of the most significant movements against the effects of inequality of the global market came with Professor Wangari Maathai of Kenya. Professor Wangari Maathai of Kenya developed the Green Belt movement, and in the early 2000s, she was the first African woman to receive a Nobel Peace Prize as a result. She sought to end the economic degradation that took place as a result of colonial exploitation by teaching important principles of soil and the environment and how to plant the appropriate plants and trees in order to help renutrient the soil to women and children across Kenya so they could not only improve their own environmental status, but have their own economic potential. The World Fair Trade Organization was a response to the criticism of the World Trade Organization and sought to create protections for children forced to work in labor, for poor wages and poor working conditions for laborers, especially across Latin America and Asia. Okay, I'm going to skip this screen right now just so that I have time to show you your assignment for the weekend. But take a moment to look over the screen on your own, take a picture of it, or return back to it. So your AP exam practice is designed for you to take time to actually do something you'll have to do on the AP World History test. Here, I've given you two separate and unique claims. And on the next slide, I'm showing you two documents. I want you to take a different approach to each document. So for claim 1, I want you to write a paragraph that seeks to prove the point that post-colonial economy was often characterized by increased globalization. And I want you to use each document as evidence to support that claim. And then I want you to do the same exact activity with a completely different claim, to take the practice of using the document to support a claim. Because remember, you'll be able to earn 2 points for that this year on your AP World History test. Here are your two documents, and all of this information is already posted in the Google Drive in the link below. I'll remind you, however, you cannot have access to manipulate these documents. If you want to change the document or work within the document, you need to first make a copy, and second, move that copy into your own Google Drive. Then you'll have the ability to manipulate the document and work with it. Thank you everybody for watching with us today. If you have questions about the AP World History test, please check in with your AP World History teacher, and we look forward to working with you again on Monday. Have a great weekend.